Okay, so in the last PowerPoint, we talked about the stages of processing food, and now we're talking specifically about mammalian digestion. This is probably going to be a little bit more familiar to you. These are structures that you've seen before, you have thought of before, and we're going to be using humans as the example for this. So here we have the diagram of a human and the whole digestive tract or alimentary canal for human. These are all terms that we will be discussing during this PowerPoint presentation. We'll go and we'll review it at the very end and put it all together as well. Okay, so the first part of the alimentary canal for vertebrates, in particular humans, is the oral cavity. And I want you to recall the different stages of the processing of food as we go through this digestive tract or the alimentary canal of humans. So remember, the very first stage is ingestion. Ingestion is when you take in the food to consume it. So that occurs in the oral cavity. The oral cavity is the same as the mouth. Within the oral cavity, teeth are initially used for mechanical digestion. And remember that mechanical digestion is grinding or chewing up food in large pieces that will convert it into smaller pieces. And then the smaller pieces are going to undergo chemical digestion. So actually, chemical digestion will also occur in the oral cavity, and we'll talk about that in just a second. First, though, we need to talk about the salivary glands, which are right here. The salivary glands deliver saliva which into the oral cavity when you consume food or when you put food into the oral cavity or the mouth. Salivary glands lubricate the food, which makes it easier to move around in your mouth, and it's going to make it easier for you to swallow. Saliva, which is what is delivered by the salivary glands, not only does it lubricate the food, but it also, so that's the mucus part of the saliva, lubricates the food, which makes it easier to swallow, but it also contains amylase, which is an enzyme, and that breaks down starch in the food. So it starts the chemical breakdown as well. I should have written chemical digestion here, but I want you to know that the oral cavity does both mechanical digestion through the chewing by the teeth and also chemical digestion through the saliva, the amylase in the saliva, which starts breaking down some of the larger molecules. Finally, within the oral cavity is the tongue, and the tongue will move the food around in the mouth, mix it with the saliva, and basically manipulate the food into a circular blob, essentially, of food and saliva called a bolus. So this mass of food and saliva, which is all lubricated now, into this bolus, it is a lot easier to swallow than if you were to just have food that wasn't lubricated and wasn't sort of formed into this ball. So the bolus is what you swallow, and the tongue actually will help push the food down to the esophagus where swallowing occurs. Well, to the pharynx where swallowing occurs, and we're going to talk about that now. All right. So the pharynx is the throat, and this figure is a little bit confusing. I don't really care. I don't care if you know about the different parts of the pharynx, so don't even worry about that. But the pharynx is at the back of the throat here. So when you swallow, here's the oral cavity right here. When you swallow, food goes from the oral cavity into the pharynx, which is going to be back here. And the pharynx, the throat, it opens to several different parts of the body. It is connected to the nasal cavity right here. It's connected to the oral cavity right here. And it's also connected to the esophagus, which is where food will go and will travel down the esophagus to the stomach. Finally, it's connected to the trachea. The trachea is not at all involved in the digestive system at all. That has to do with respiration and the respiratory system, but it is important for you to know that the pharynx, where the food goes after you swallow it, there's a possibility that it could actually enter the trachea. It's not supposed to, but it can get there under certain circumstances. So the trachea is also called the windpipe. And again, that's going to lead to the lungs, not part of the digestive system. The way we can avoid getting food into our trachea, which causes us to choke, is when we swallow, this little flap here called the epiglottis actually folds down and it covers the trachea, and it gives you a straight path then down to the esophagus, which is where the food is supposed to go. So swallowing causes the epiglottis to block the entry to the trachea, and then the bolus is guided down the esophagus, and the esophagus is going to connect the oral cavity. Basically the esophagus is going to connect the pharynx to the stomach. Sometimes when you have a problem with your swallowing and maybe some water gets into the opening of your trachea, then that induces coughing, which can then allow you to get little droplets of water or food out of your trachea and back into your pharynx, where you can then redirect it out into your oral cavity, or back here where you can swallow it. So if you get a little bit of water or food into your trachea, not a big deal, because you can get that out through coughing. But if a big blob of food were to block the trachea opening, that is when you can't breathe and you can choke. Okay. So we've already gone through this a little bit, but I'm just going to show you sort of how this works. In this scenario, there's a bolus in your mouth, so this is going to be the food. And as the bolus is in your mouth, you can see here that your trachea is open to your pharynx, and you can be breathing through your nose. So here's a pathway for air. Okay, you're breathing through your nose while there's food in your mouth. Once you swallow, though, here you're swallowing, you've pushed the bolus down by pushing up your tongue, and the epiglottis covers up the trachea, and now the food can easily go down your esophagus. Okay, so once there's food in your esophagus, how does it get to your stomach? Well, within the esophagus, and the esophagus is basically just a long tube that connects the pharynx to the stomach. Food is actually pushed down the esophagus through something called peristalsis. Peristalsis is systematic contractions of muscles in the wall of the esophagus that basically push the food down from the top to the bottom. You can even swallow something upside down, and peristalsis will direct it upwards to your stomach if you happen to be hanging upside down. The way this happens is you've got these valves, which are called sphincters, and sphincters are muscular parts that sort of contract, and they don't let the bolus go back up towards your pharynx. They regulate the movement of the material between the compartments, or in this case, the bolus. The cardiac or esophageal sphincter is the sphincter that occurs right at the end of the esophagus and into the stomach. So it's not listed here, but the cardiac sphincter or esophageal sphincter would be right here. That's the end of the esophagus and right before it reaches the stomach. So then what about reverse peristalsis? Think about what reverse peristalsis would be. That would be if there was food here and it got pushed all the way back up. So reverse peristalsis is what causes vomiting, where you've got these contractions going in the opposite direction. If your body is trying to eliminate something that's in your stomach because it's ill, or maybe you've eaten something bad, reverse peristalsis is the way that the body gets rid of that, by vomiting. I think there's a video associated with this that I want to show you.
In the mouth cavity, food is chewed into small pieces by the teeth and mixed with saliva.
Food is chewed into small pieces by the
The tongue
teeth
rolls
and
the
mixed with
food into
saliva.
a soft mass called a bolus.
The tongue rolls the food into a soft
During
mass
swallowing,
called
the
a
tongue
bolus.
rises to push the bolus towards
During
the pharynx.
swallowing, the tongue rises to
The
push the
soft
bolus
palate
towards
moves
the
up
pharynx.
to prevent the bolus from entering the
The
nasal
soft
cavity.
palate moves up to prevent the
The
bolus from entering
epiglottis
the
also
nasal
lowers
cavity.
to cover the opening to the
The
trachea.
epiglottis also
This
lowers
prevents
to
the
cover
bolus
the
from
opening to
entering
the
the
trachea. This prevents
I love how
the
it's called the
bolus from
trachea.
entering the trachea. The bolus
wall of the
enters the esophagus.
consists of circular muscles
The
and
wall of the
longitudinal
esophagus
muscles.
consists of circular muscles
When the
and
bolus enters the
longitudinal muscles.
esophagus, the circular muscles
When
behind
the
it
bolus
contract,
enters the
and
esophagus,
the
the
longitudinal
circular
muscles
muscles
relax.
behind it contract, and the
At the same
longitudinal
time, the
muscles
circular
relax.
muscles in front of the bolus relax.
At the same
and
time,
the
the
longitudinal
circular
muscles
muscles in
contract.
front of the bolus relax,
These
and the
actions push the
longitudinal
bolus
muscles
down the
contract.
esophagus to the stomach.
These actions push the bolus
This
down the
alternate
esophagus to the
contraction
stomach.
and relaxation of the muscles
This
produces
alternate
a
contraction
wave-like
and
movement
relaxation
called
of the muscles
peristalsis.
produces a wave-like movement called peristalsis.
Get out of there. And back to this. So, having some trouble getting back to my presentation. There we go. All right, so we just finished peristalsis, and now we're going to talk about the stomach. So remember, at the end of the esophagus, we have the cardiac or esophageal sphincter, which leads to the stomach. So the two main functions of the stomach are storage, which means that the stomach is storing the food, and it's actually going to process it into something that's essentially like a liquid. Okay, so the stomach is kind of filled with liquid. The bolus is going to enter the stomach, and the stomach will store it there for a while. I mentioned earlier that in some cases, in some vertebrates, in some animals, that the stomach also functions a little bit in mechanical digestion because it is muscular and it can churn the food a little bit. So there can be some mechanical digestion, but more typically, the stomach is responsible for chemical digestion. And when the stomach is churning the food, one benefit of that, even if it's not breaking it up more, it's exposing it to a bunch of the gastric acids that are in the stomach. So by churning the food, it's basically assisting with the chemical digestion. The stomach has gastric juices that are released by particular cells in the stomach wall. So there are two cells that I want you guys to know about. The chief cells, those secrete pepsin, and the parietal cells secrete HCl, which is hydrochloric acid. Okay, so if we look at this, here's the gastric lining of the stomach. You can see that they call it here mucosa. So this is basically mucus-covered tissue in the stomach, and you can see there's a whole bunch of layers. These are called rugae. I don't think I have that anywhere on your slide, but that's okay. So, but you've got all these folds, and that's going to increase the surface area of the stomach, which means they can release more gastric juices. So here's a chief cell. The chief cell is going to secrete pepsin out of these gastric pits and into the lumen of the stomach. Here's the parietal cells. Those are going to release hydrochloric acid, again, out through these little gastric pits into the body of the stomach. So the reason why the stomach lining has this mucus covering is, you may remember from before, that is one benefit or one way of having the stomach lining not be digested by its own chemicals that it's releasing. Okay, so this mucus that's covering the cells is to avoid the hydrochloric acid and the pepsin, that would damage the cells. So there are some potential problems, though. One thing that can happen is you've got all this acid squishing around in your stomach and being churned around. Acid reflux or heartburn can be caused when some of these acids basically move from the stomach. If the esophageal sphincter isn't working very well, some of the stomach acids, the gastric acids, can move back up into your esophagus, and that's what acid reflux is, and it causes heartburn, that pain that you get like right here. Also, gastric ulcers can occur where you have some bleeding in the lining of your stomach. Sometimes those are caused by particular bacteria that can be really damaging to the lining and can cause some breaches in the mucosa. One bacteria that causes a lot of gastric ulcers is called H. pylori. I don't have it written here on the slide, but you might see that in your book. And they damage the mucosa, and then the lining is much more prone to being damaged further by the digestive enzymes that are churning around in your stomach. So assuming everything is going okay, then what happens is the food that is sort of churning around with the acids in the stomach moves from the stomach down through the pyloric sphincter, which is at the bottom of the stomach, and into the small intestine. So here's going to be the small intestine right here. Oh, I forgot to mention this. The mixture of ingested food and gastric juice, once it's in the stomach, it's called chyme, C-H-Y-M-E. So chyme is what's going to enter the small intestine. The small intestine is next on the list. So here's the small intestine. The small intestine is the longest compartment of the alimentary canal, or the digestive tract, and it's called the small intestine not because of how long it is, because it's the longest, but it is a small in diameter, which means like it's not a very wide I'm trying to show you this tube, whereas the large intestine is a much wider tube, the small intestine is a narrow tube. So that's why it's called the small intestine. I also want to mention, I should have mentioned before, remember the different stages of processing food. You had ingestion through the mouth. Digestion was also started in the mouth, but also then into the stomach. There was a lot of digestion there, chemical digestion. And now that we're in the small intestine, there's still a little bit of chemical digestion here that occurs. But the main thing that's going to happen in the small intestine is absorption. So that's going to be that third stage of processing food. Now let me back up just a little bit so we can talk about the three different parts of the small intestine. They are divided into these three pretty difficult names to remember. The first part is called the duodenum, and the duodenum is right where the stomach connects to the small intestine. Again, remember this is the pyloric sphincter right here. Then you have the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. The middle part where you have all this layering, this is called the jejunum. And the end part of the small intestine is called the ileum. And the ileum is going to attach to the large intestine. And we'll see that on the next slide. Okay, so as I was saying, there's some chemical digestion here. I think I might have said there's a little chemical digestion here, but there's a lot of chemical digestion that happens here and also in the stomach. And then absorption of nutrients is this is the main place where absorption of nutrients is happening. If you were to look at the inside of the small intestine really closely, you'd see that there's also, similar to the stomach, there's these ridges. There's these ridges that increase surface area, and these ridges are covered in these villi, which again are basically finger-like projections which increase surface area, And the villi are actually covered with microvilli, which are just smaller little projections. All of this is to increase the surface area, which aids in absorption of nutrients. So at this point in the small intestine, the molecules are small enough to be absorbed into the intestinal wall, and they're going to enter the bloodstream there. So here you have the veins and arteries that are attached to the small intestine, and nutrients are going to be absorbed through there, and they're going to make it into the bloodstream from the outside of the small intestine. Some important things to remember about the small intestine. This is where a lot of the chemical digestion is occurring in the duodenum, which remember is the top part of the small intestine. Here's the stomach. Here's the small intestine. This is the duodenum. And you've got all of these accessory glands that actually attach to the duodenum through these little ducts. So you've got the pancreas, which is down here. The pancreas secretes enzymes, which help to digest proteins, starch, and fat. And there's a duct right here that goes to the duodenum, where so chemical digestion can occur here through the pancreatic juices. The liver produces bile, and here's the duct coming from the liver. The gallbladder stores and releases the bile. So essentially the liver produces bile, and then it's held in the gallbladder. And whenever you eat and food, or I guess chyme, goes into the duodenum, the gallbladder will release some of that bile right here. And the bile breaks down fats, so it's going to facilitate in fat digestion. Okay, so you've got all these accessory organs that are associated with the duodenum to help with the chemical digestion. And then, but this is at the very beginning of the small intestine, and as you move down the small intestine to the jejunum and the ileum, that's where most of the absorption is going to happen. Okay, after the ileum of the small intestine, that's going to hook up to the large intestine. So this is going to be the last part of the alimentary canal, the large intestine. Absorption is the main thing that happens in the large intestine. Here, you're not absorbing so much nutrients because most of the nutrients were absorbed in the small intestine, but the large intestine is really important for absorbing water. So you've got all this water that's mixed in with the chyme and the food and all the stuff that the body needs to absorb in terms of the nutrients, but the body also needs to reabsorb a lot of the water that has been mixed in. So, and that happens in the large intestine. So the water is reabsorbed, and what's left is feces. So the feces is the waste products after you've removed a bunch of water from it. And the water essentially gets reprocessed into your body. There are three parts of the large intestine. The cecum, which is right here. You can see here, this is where the small intestine is attaching. Here's the cecum, so this is the beginning of the large intestine. Then you've got the colon, which includes the ascending colon, the transverse colon, and the descending colon. And then finally, the rectum and the anal canal, and this is where waste is released. The feces are released here. So if we want to talk about what the cecum does, it has different functions in different species. So the cecum aids in fermentation of plant material. And again, it's right here. The appendix is a little projection that's off of the cecum. For humans, it's not really that necessary. It has a minor role in immunity for us, but many people think of this as sort of a useless structure we don't need anymore, but our ancestors needed it, and it was, again, helps to digest plant materials. So the cecum is more important in some other animals than we are. If you were an herbivore, your cecum would be much more highly evolved for that sort of digestion. Okay, and so you've got the appendix, the cecum, ascending, transverse, descending colon, and then the rectum at the very end. which leads to the anus, and that's where the final stage of elimination occurs. So let's just go through this really quickly one more time. You have, at the very beginning of the alimentary canal or the digestive tract of mammals, you have the mouth, which is mostly responsible for mechanical digestion, and you've got the ingestion first, and then mechanical digestion, some chemical digestion through saliva, the amylase in the saliva. Then you've got the pharynx, which is the throat, which is going to help the bolus of food that's formed from the tongue move down through the pharynx and into the esophagus through the process of peristalsis. At the end of the esophagus, you have the cardiac or esophageal sphincter right here leading to the stomach. In the stomach, you may have some mechanical digestion, but you have a lot of chemical digestion through the parietal cells and the chief cells that are releasing hydrochloric acid and pepsin. Then down here, you have the, I'm trying to remember the name of the sphincter. Can't remember the name of the sphincter right now. Into the small intestine, and this is the duodenum, which is the very beginning of the small intestine. You've got the gallbladder, the liver, and the pancreas, which are all involved, and accessory organs, which are helping the chemical digestion occur in the duodenum of the small intestine. But then the rest of the small intestine, and it's really long, is going to be involved mostly in absorption of nutrients. At the end of the small intestine, which is the ileum of the small intestine, you've got the duodenum up here, jejunum, ileum down here. This is going to be connected to the large intestine, which is the last part of the digestive tract. The cecum, ascending colon, descending colon, ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, down to the rectum, and then the anus where elimination occurs. Again, the colon is heavily involved in absorption, not of nutrients, but of water, so that we can recycle a bunch of the water that we've used in terms of sort of getting that food down through our digestive tract. We need to reabsorb that water because water is something that our bodies need to conserve. Okay, so that's the end of that one, and I believe there's just one more PowerPoint for this digestive system.